The same religion that's capable of hideous acts of destruction can also be capable of moments of healing, of restoration, and of hope.
But educate a girl, and you educate her entire family.
There is a sun within every person.
When that anger sets in, write it. Write the letters, but don't send them. You never want to leave concrete proof of insanity.
The phenomenon of a political Catholicism became stable in Italian politics, unlike other European countries where believers are mixed politically in all parties with other citizens. The death of the Christian Democrats produced the diaspora of Catholics in several parties, some of them claiming a religious loyalty, some not. But in any case, Catholics are still tortured by the problem of their identity as believers, of their political identity as believers. They still ask themselves how to preserve their Catholic identity, say, in the center-left New Party, the Democratic Party, or in the center-right party, Forza Italia, Berlusconi's party. That is what I call the mourning for political Catholicism. And that is also the reason why Catholicism became so aggressive and sometimes fundamentalist in Italy, as it tried to preserve a disappearing political identity. Also the birth, in these weeks, of a new pro-life electoral list. You know that there are general elections in Italy in this month, is another chapter of this story, one of the last, I think. The story of a political Catholicism is at the end. This at least is my opinion. Not everyone shares this opinion. But you must understand that these final convulsions of a long tradition bear some consequences. The Vatican is now facing the increasing secularization of Italian people in terms of attendance at religious services, of vocations, and even in terms of obedience to religious moral precepts. Birth rate is now the lowest in the world. Accepted morality is as secularized as in all Western countries. So the Vatican takes advantage of the identity crisis of Catholic politicians, continually recalling them to their duty of obedience, and so exerting a direct influence on government. It tries to balance his lack of moral authority with obtaining a political direct influence. Let us look at 2 or 3 political events of the recent past. At the beginning of the 70s, the Vatican could not stop the passage of the divorce law. It could not do anything else except call a referendum to abrogate the law. But a high majority, around 60%, refused to cancel the new law. This was 1974. All of us felt that the old religious rural Italy, Italietta it was called in the early 20th century, was dead. It was a turn in the history of contemporary Italy. Some years later, the abortion law. In this case, too, the law passed notwithstanding the opposition of the Church. Again, a referendum was held, and the law was approved by the voters. And this was 1981. These were 2 great defeats for the Church. Since then, things have changed. The situation I described above, the identity crisis of Catholic politicians, the new aggressive strategy of the Church, met another important development, the crisis of the party system in the first half of the 90s. Now there is no longer as dominant a party as the Democrazia Cristiana or the Communist Party. After the fall of these parties, and of the Socialist Party too, and the reform that changed from a proportional to a majority system, Italian politics is home to a lot of parties, many of them very small, desperately searching marginal votes to win elections or to have a representation in assembly. So every party appeals to Catholic voters, even if the polls show that there are not a serious constituency. Most of them, most of Catholics, place themselves along the political spectrum. But even 1, 5, or 2% of voters is worth being searched in the actual situation, in the present situation. In this way, the Vatican or the Bishops' Conference assume a directly political authority. They can recall believers, first of all politicians, to obey the Pope's command. They have also published a kind of a handbook for Catholic politicians that affirms the obligation to obey religious precepts as they are formulated by religious authorities. In this climate, the story of the law on assisted reproduction, which took place in 2004 and 2005, has been very different from that on divorce or that on abortion. Bishops dictated the not remissible limits to be placed on assisted reproduction, which was, it must be remembered, already practiced in Italy, even if only in private clinics. And these limits were prohibition of any kind of genetic manipulation, prohibition of embryo freezing, prohibition of prenatal diagnosis, the obligation to insert all the embryos, and of course, access only for married couples. Bishops also dictated the limits, very strict indeed, of parliamentary negotiation. The result was that our law on assisted reproduction is the most strict, the strictest in Europe. And when a referendum was held to abrogate this law, the bishops suggested the best tactic to win. That was to abstain from the vote, hence avoiding the required quorum needed for political participation. Because for us, a referendum is valid only if there is a quorum, a number of participation, a minimum number of participants. Since a certain number of voters do usually abstain, the Church could thus add to this normal abstention the qualified abstention it suggested and declare itself the winner. So this was a victory for the Church. What I suggest is that the situation is deeply changed from the 70s and to now. It seems clear that the demand for a public role for religion is a global phenomenon, often characterized by a fundamentalistic trend. In Catholicism, too, some fundamentalism has developed, perhaps due to the competition with evangelical churches. What is typical in the Italian case, however, is the tendency of the Church to be at the center of a political debate and possibly to lead it. The Church apparently aims to exert an hegemonic leadership, by this Gramscian word, I mean a leadership which appeals not only to Catholics, but also to people who are not Catholics, but share a concern about ethical values. From this standpoint, we can see that in recent years, the Catholic Church has developed an unexpected capacity to enter the public discourse using arguments that can speak to and can be used by people who do not identify themselves as Catholics. This is the reason why it chooses to concentrate on ethical issues, a choice made already by Pope Wojtyła and confirmed by the present Pope. When these issues, ethical issues, are at stake, the Church knows it can have a large audience and a strong influence. This is true mainly on bioethical questions, which imply new ways of living, imposing personal and public choices on matters before ruled by nature or by traditional customs. These questions raise doubts and sometimes anxiety in many people. This happens everywhere, I think. But in Italy, there is a general suspicion of science and scientific research, which is a specific feature of our culture, high as well as low. For reasons too complex to be analyzed here, it is easy in our country to spread the idea that scientific research, and even more so technology, serve obscure interests and tend to immoral ends. Researchers and scientists are in principle suspected of having sold their souls to the devil, of course that is the prophet, or of aiming to create monsters. Faust or Frankenstein, they can be. This is a cultural background that finds philosophical inspiration in Heidegger's thought and a more archaic and popular root in the widespread belief in magicians, a belief really widespread in Italy. On this basis, the Catholic Church has an easy time in claiming that scientific research must be controlled or moralized from outside, by the law, or even better, by a moral authority. Of course, the Church, first of all. It has imposed on the public discourse the theme of life as a moral and a human value, which is contrasted to the claimed utilitarian and the merely instrumental value of scientific knowledge. In doing so, it claims to defend the very core of human nature and destiny, not necessarily in a religious sense. In fact, this message seems to be accepted by many people who are not religious. The so-called atei devoti, devout atheists, who recognize that the Church has a leading role in the defense of humanity, are not so few. And even without arriving at this extravagant profession of faith, there are many who think that the Church's ethical mission is of special importance to society, following also the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. The best playing field for this role was the debate on the law on assisted reproduction. That debate was, in my opinion, a real turning point in Italian public life. In this case, exactly 30 years since the referendum on divorce took place, the Church faced a completely different cultural and political situation, and its strategy too was dissimilar and much more effective. The front-runners were not the Pope and the bishops, but scientists, intellectuals, and columnists of Catholic inspiration. They held that the embryo is in full sense a person, not as a religious principle, but as an objective truth derived from scientific arguments. They held that ethical truths are grounded in natural law and consequently they cannot be submitted to the usual process of political deliberation. They claimed that the absolute priority of natural ethics over science and even over democracy. The secularists, on the other hand, should be able to assert the idea that science is not a merely instrumental activity, rather a deeply ethical activity in which human nature reaches one of its best expressions, an activity too which is characterized by a strong internal control following strict public protocols that is much more than what can be said of politics or religion. But they were not able to do that. We were not able to do that. Neither were they able to convince people that assisted reproduction is not a factory of monsters, but a way to give birth to babies who would have otherwise never been born, and so to increase happiness and life itself. The secular answer was almost solely based on the principle of individual freedom or individual autonomy, a very important principle, obviously, but insufficient, I think, to respond to the ethical concerns of a lot of people. So Catholics got the better of it. They won the referendum, as I said above, just because of the large abstentions from the vote. But they undoubtedly won the leadership of the debate on this subject. They imposed on all Catholic politicians, even those who are leftist liberal, the idea that bioethical issues are to be seen as those issues that go beyond the boundaries between politics and ethics, or beyond the separation between church and state. As one cardinal said, there is a universe of moral values that is prior to public rules. In other words, bioethics cannot be regulated by democracy, with its political principles, freedom, equality, equal respect, but by this universe of moral values of which the Church is the best interpreter and guardian. And of course, this idea strongly supports the public role of religion and its unique contribution to the community's ethical life. This script was repeated on the issue of civil unions, Pax, we say Pax following a French definition. The center-left government tried many times with different bills to reach an agreement on a light form, a soft form of civil union, without success. Catholic representatives felt it was impossible to agree on any bill. To give the right weight to that, you should know that the civil unions do exist in 17 European countries, and 2 more, by the way, Catholic countries like Austria and Ireland, are now discussing a bill on them. Italy seems to be a special case in Europe, along with Poland and Greece. In this discussion, the new attitude of the Catholic Church was even more evident. Catholics never said that being a non-married couple, or at worst a homosexual couple, is a sin before God. They argue that matrimony is a basic necessary institution of social life, one that must be protected and safeguarded. To this extent, many liberals would agree, like, for example, Ronald Dworkin. But most liberals would not agree that legal recognition of other kinds of couples is a danger for matrimony. Of course, the point here was to admit that in modern societies there are several forms of a family, not all of them based on traditional matrimony. To this, again, Catholics did not answer that there is one and only one family established by God. They argued that children need to be reared by a regular parental couple consisting of a man and a woman to have a sane and correct development, both psychologically and morally. We can object that no evidence supports this idea, but it certainly meets common sense. We do not know if the Church would prevail on this subject if a referendum took place. Polls indeed suggest that there is a majority in favor of civil unions in Italy. But a weak government and the weak parties could not defy the moral force of the Church, a force that it showed also in stopping any attempt to authorize living wills or to give terminally ill patients even a partial right to interrupt the treatments and let themselves die. Now I come to discuss some implications of what I have said for the idea and the practice of secularism. No, ma questo era il precedente. I have stressed that Church's capacity to speak in the public domain and even to dominate it when certain issues are at stake, namely ethical issues regarding bioethics and family, No, I have stressed the Church's capacity to speak in the public domain on these issues. Faced with this capacity, the usual accusation of interference is ineffective. Even the appeal for church-state separation, what we call state laicality, is a weak argument, since the stand for ethical values in papal speeches or in bishops' statements cannot attempt that laicality, which is established in the Italian constitution. And I definitely find it wrong to treat the Church as the greatest or the unique enemy of the free thinking and individual freedom, as many other illiberal tendencies cross the public culture of our country, preparing the field for Catholic hegemony. This means that an old version of secularism, confident in the superior rationality of non-believers, and therefore rather arrogant towards believers, suspicious of any public role of religion, ready to find clerical interference in any statement, also in those directed only to the people of faith, is anti-religious rather than respectful of pluralism. Each of us can, of course, be anti-religious in his or her personal convictions, but as citizens, we are obliged to respect our fellow citizens. We have no right to treat believers as half-citizens or as half-rational people. Only if we do respect them are we authorized to claim that they must renounce imposing their ethical views on society. From this standpoint, the Catholic Italian question is a case of a more general question. Which is or can be the status of secularism in Western democracies today? We all know that things are changing. Religious and cultural pluralism has grown in an unexpected way. The old secularism, based on the privatization of religion, is showing signs of wear. Religious more and more often refuse to be confined in the private sphere. On the other hand, the boundaries of private and public spheres are no longer clear. Some scholars have even spoken of a desecularization of the world, a social and cultural process which would prove the secularization theories so influential in the 20th century to be wrong. It is a sociological and a philosophico-political process, one which requires a new reflection on secularism and a new definition of the public role of religion. I see two different models of separation, the American and the French. The difference between the two depends mainly on the different relationships of state and citizens. It mirrors the distance between liberal politics, which produces tolerance of religious pluralism, and continental, not just French politics, which produces a state-based secularism, where the state intends to form citizens rather than to protect their diversity. Just think of the recent law on religious symbols that forbids the wearing of the Islamic veil within public schools. Both patterns have a typical linguistic expression. Laïcité, the French word, is different in meaning from secularism and is asymmetrical to religious freedom. Even better, the word which to my mind expresses most the ideas peculiar to the Anglo-American debate is tolerance, a word virtually absent in the debate on secularism in Europe. We could say that laïcité and tolerance are two different options in the political treatment of religious diversity. The former, laïcité, refuses any public role of religion. The latter, tolerance, defines forms and the limits of it. Ironically enough, Italy has a regime of a concordat that is, of course, the weakest form of separation, but its secular culture draws its inspiration from the French model. I think that the second option, tolerance, is better equipped to face a desecularized world. My point is that the present rise of religions requires a reshaping of the secular principle and the very idea of separation. to strengthen the impartiality of public institutions and at the same time to refine its meaning and applications, which implies, in my opinion, revising the borders of liberal citizenship to include the public expression of religious convictions and feelings. Restricting religion to the private sphere, in fact, is perhaps possible in a Christian context. Secularism is not only a regime of church-state separation, it also requires an agreement among the different churches, as happened in Europe as a result of the religious wars. This agreement was made simpler because those churches shared the same God, book, feasts, and history, and nonetheless it cost so much blood. How to tackle the case of a variety of religions with different gods, books, feasts, history, which moreover have ethnic, cultural roots, and an identifying faction in a world of competing identities? This situation cannot be faced by a state-based secularist approach. In such a situation, tolerance, much more than laicité, seems to be the best approach to secure the coexistence of a variety of religions and the autonomy of the political sphere. Tolerant secularism allows religion a public role, provided that, on one hand, the believers accept pluralism as a feature of democracy, and therefore give up their claim to absolute truth in the domain of politics, of course. And, on the other hand, the non-believers recognize believers' equal dignity, and therefore give up the idea that religious people are irrational. None of these conditions exist in Italy today. Such a revision of citizenship must be founded on the principles of equality of different religions as well as of believers and non-believers, and freedom of every individual citizen. Not, I think, on the importance of the contribution that religions can bring to the common God, as suggested by Böckenförde, partially drawn on by Habermas. In the latter case, indeed, the principle of separation, as well as democracy itself, would be distorted. We could prefer one religion to another because of its apparent usefulness. On the other hand, however, I would stress that giving religion a public role does recognize the right of churches to participate in the public debate with their arguments, but does not recognize their right to play a directly political role by supporting candidates or parties or particular policies. The recognition of the public role of religion, in other words, must come with a strong autonomy of the political domain and with the recognition of the primary duty for politicians to respect citizens' liberties. I mean that we have to distinguish, not confuse, between the public role of religion and the direct political role of churches. This is, I think, a fundamental distinction. Can I continue? I have here the last part of my talk. I have no more slides, but the last part of my talk is on a typical philosophical question, a comparison between Rawls and Habermas on the theme of religion. I'm afraid that it's too long to read entirely. I would try to cut, and I will read and to this idea of public reason. I give for known the idea of public reason in Rawls. You know that the public reason is the set of political arguments that we can and we must use to justify political institutions, and that cannot be drawn from our religious or secular comprehensive doctrine. This idea of public reason has been interpreted by some as if the Rawlsian model excluded religion from the public sphere and thereby demanded some kind of internal laceration of the citizens, or a sort of double phase, one directed to the public sphere, in which religious faith must be silent, one directed to the private sphere, in which this faith may speak freely. This objection is largely unfounded, because in Rawls a dichotomy between public and private does not exist. In fact, it is not true at all that comprehensive doctrines, religious or secular, must remain silent in the domain of public reason. This is a wrong interpretation of Rawls. To say this means to have failed to understand the meaning of overlapping consensus, which requires that the political conception is supported by the citizens on the ground of their reasonable comprehensive doctrines. Otherwise, there would be no need for overlapping consensus. Some form of empirical convergence would suffice, based on any available reason. Rawls expresses this very clearly when he says, citizens affirm the ideal of a public reason not as a result of a political compromise, as in a modus vivendi, in a convergence, but from within their own reasonable doctrine. And there is a good example for this. The principles of freedom and equality of all citizens can be affirmed by believers from within the belief that all people have been created equal by God, as well as by non-believers from within a secular view of the unity of mankind as a natural species. Thus, the limits of public reason do not require that the deepest truth about human nature or the good be set aside. The most prominent critic of Rawls's idea of public reason is Jürgen Habermas. In a recent text on religion in the public sphere, he has more thoroughly clarified his criticism. It's a text of 2 years ago. With the intention of taking an intermediary position between liberals who support the neutrality of the state and those who claim a role for religion within the public arena, Habermas insists that the secular state, whilst committed to neutrality with regard to choices of faith, cannot expect its religious citizens to always rigorously distinguish between secular reasons and religious reasons. This would in reality entail an excessive burden for citizens of faith. To compensate for this asymmetry, a political relationship based on mutual respect will not suffice. Instead, a real and thorough epistemic confrontation is required. Secular citizens, in Habermas' opinion, must take responsibility for a change in mentality that is no less difficult, accepting in a full sense what it means to live in a post-secular society, that is, a society in which the survival of religious communities is not an archaic residue, but a vital reality, rich in truth contents, inviting exploration. In substance, the secular citizen must be at the same time agnostic and prepared to learn from religion. In this way, the German philosopher believes he has resolved the conflict between the excessive demands of Rawls that would put religious citizens in difficulty and the excessive revisionism of his critics, who risk losing the neutrality of the state, and with it, in the end, religious freedom itself, which depends on this neutrality. In fact, this reflection creates I mean the reflection of Habermas, creates other and not minor problems. The most critical aspect, in my view, lies in the fact that in order to overcome the presumed split between public reason and comprehensive doctrines, Habermas introduces another and much more serious split between secular citizens and religious citizens, what Rawls never does. This juxtaposition does not exist in Rawls, who speaks of both secular and religious comprehensive doctrines. Suffice it to note that among these he includes the liberalism of Kant and that of Mill, as well as the secular humanism of Dewey. Without giving, so, any special status to religion as such, public reasons are not for Rawls secular reasons, but reasons that have their autonomous foundation in the political sphere. So, I would like to stress, so there is not a logical priority of secular reasons in comparison to religious reasons. The consequences of these are, one, that a problem arises between secular and religious citizens that is perhaps more problematic than that regarding the relationship between political values and the comprehensive values. Second, that the solution found to this problem is extremely laborious and asks of the citizens even more than does Rawls, given that an epistemic confrontation and reciprocal learning are advocated by Habermas. Third, that the distinction of an institutional sphere within the public sphere becomes purely functional. This institutional sphere is indeed one that is conceived as not producing autonomous values. The domain of politics is not considered as a realm of reasons and ideas, but just as an institutional construction. This engenders the problem of the weakness of the ethical foundations of the state, and leads Habermas to grant religion a special role on this terrain. If the political domain does not have its own values, we must search for values somewhere else, for example, in religion. And I'm ending. It may seem that of the two, it is Habermas who demonstrates the greater awareness towards requests for a public role for religion. In reality, however, the process of reciprocal learning alludes to a tendential drawing together of citizens which, besides being, according to the writer himself, improbable, proves also to be unmotivated. Habermas seems to retain a residual fear of liberal pluralism. The Rawlsian distinction between public reason and background culture, which he has extensively criticized, has instead the merit of not requiring any cultural confluence between citizens and of allowing pluralism to be fully lived. I mean, Rawls lets pluralism where it is. Worth stressing also is the fact that a dialogue requiring the kind of commitment that Habermas is proposing, a reciprocal learning process that would require a voyage through the genealogy of reason, whilst hard enough to imagine in relation to Christian denominations, seems extremely problematic if it is intended as an invitation to all religions, that is to say, including religions which have not shared either in the history of Western reason or in the experience of secularization that has changed the forms of religious conscience in the West. I think that Rawls's binary opposition of public and non-public is much more helpful and respectful of pluralism than the religious secular opposition. In these times of resurgent religious fundamentalism, attempting to avoid a head-on confrontation between religious and secular citizens or religious and secular doctrines is difficult but very important if a liberal democratic society is to survive. Rawlsian public reason never allows for either the idea of a secular superior rationality or the idea of a religious ethical superiority. a polarization which represents, I think, one of the greatest dangers for our societies. Thank you.
What I want to ask you about is that while there would be little disagreement, I think, in this audience about respect for the other and the importance of toleration, the question becomes, how do you move from those very broad values to more specific values of how you adjudicate tolerance in a pluralistic system? To make my question more specific, in the United States, we have a lot of talk about tolerance, but when we get around to what the legislature does, the legislature has to, as our speaker earlier in the day was talking about, somehow adjudicate in those principles of tolerance. But to do that, what do you fall back upon? Votes? Votes of the people, votes of the Congress, the legislature? Do you fall back upon the judicial system in terms of having legal precedents of what is the way tolerance is to be expressed? Basically, my question is, how do you move beyond the broad normative commitment to tolerance to more specific expressions of how a democratic system operates and still honor the principle of tolerance? Do I make myself clear?
Of course, this passage is the real difficult thing to pass from the general definition of tolerance or toleration to the specific functioning of democracy. I think that with Rawls and Habermas that we must think of deliberative democracy. I mean, a democracy which consists not only of voting, so of majorities. Of course, there must be a moment in which we vote, but this moment comes after a process of public debate, of institutional debate in the parliaments, the process of decision making as we said this morning, and it's a complex process in which I think we meet several difficulties, several stops, but we have to follow a kind of ideal of the reason. Of course, I'm speaking with Rawls by a semi-Kantian point of view, you know. So the public reason, this idea of public reason, this idea of toleration is an ideal of reason, which is difficult to realize totally, to realize as a fact, as an everyday fact. But it's important to have it because it leads us on the right path. It leads us to search agreement, to affirm respect, to affirm reciprocity with the other citizens. And I think that democracy is a highly highly imperfect system, of course, highly imperfect regime, but its merit is just in its imperfection, in this research. I agree, I understand that it's very difficult to realize this kind of relations among citizens and between citizens and politics. But I don't think that there is an easier way. This is the real way of democracy.
Place in your paper, you suggest that you don't think that the model you're proposing necessarily means that religious or secular groups should necessarily get directly involved in the political process. Now, it seems to me that's almost inevitable when you start talking. It seems to me it's almost inevitable that that will happen. Now, what we've seen in the United States is an evolution of norms about what it means to be directly involved in the political process. There was a time in our culture when it was viewed as very much out of order for churches to endorse particular candidates. That has changed. Happens all the time now. So the norms about proper role in the political process often change, but there is always some, at least in the American case, there's always some kind of direct political involvement, whether it's the organizing of constituencies to support certain issues or certain candidates, or whether it's encouragement in a subtle way to go vote, code word to vote certain ways. So we have lots of ways in which people get involved, and religious organizations and secular organizations get involved in the political process. Are you suggesting that should not happen?
I think that, of course, in part, it's inevitable, this political involvement of the churches. In our case, it's the church. But I think that it's important to put some limits to this involvement. For example, I think that maybe you can't imagine what happens in Italy. In Italy, we have, for example, in these elections, in this electoral campaign, not directly a bishop, fortunately, but the editor of the newspaper of the Bishops' Conference has openly affirmed that it's a good thing that there is a party which is entitled to the Christian doctrine in the Italian political panorama. We have now a reshaping of the political system. New parties emerge and old parties disappear. And the church says what party it wants. This is a kind of involvement that I think is excessive, is unbearable. Or even when they say that the difference is, I think the difference is here. I think that is totally right. It may be not pleasant for some of us, but it's right that the church say we are contrary to abortion. We think that the embryo freezing is wrong. We think that the Catholic doctrine is that. But I think that after having said that, they ought to be silent. They can't say, you, Catholic politician, you must obey to me. You can't do the synthesis in your conscience. You must obey. This is a novelty, on the other hand, in Italy, a partial novelty, because in the past, the church let more liberty to Catholic politicians. Now, it says you must do that. You can't do parliamentary negotiations about these ethical issues. Catholic values in this field are non-negotiable. Not negotiable values. But why Catholic values, for example, in the field of society or of work, of economic relations, are negotiable instead? Why? Where is the difference between these two fields? I think that the difference is that in this field, the Church finds again leadership, finds again a capacity to lead Italian people who in other fields don't follow the Church. And excuse me, my English is. I would stress the question of the weakness of politics. The weakness of Italian political system is the real reason why the Church is so ready to interfere. If political system, Italian political system grows, improves in its strengthens, I think that a better balance will be found. Because the case of Zapatero in Spain, it's not that Zapatero is more strong or more courageous than Italian politicians. Zapatero has a political system very strong. He's the leader of a strong party. In Italy, so far, until this moment, there is no party which is strong, which is which can be able to respond to the Church, stay at your place, and we do politics, we do our job.
So I was curious, when the Church is attempting to put forward claims defending a common human core, I think that was the language you used, are they resorting to the tradition of natural law? Natural law tradition of Catholic theology, because that gives them, it does come close to giving a kind of humanistic language, and also posits itself as somehow an equivalent to science too, because it would seem then to serve a number of needs in terms of that hegemonic repositioning.
The Church has the capacity to speak a language which is not just a religious language. It's a humanistic language. It's a language which appeals to value of life, the value of human relations, human affectivity, all things that are really important and appear more and more important in a period of anxiety, in a period of fear towards new foundings of discoveries of science and so. I think that yes, the natural law is the language of natural law is a language very important for Catholic Church, for the Catholic Church, and I think that is one of it's a force for it, because the natural law does not make an immediate reference to God. No, we can speak to the natural reason of man without necessarily speak of God. Of course, we think that God created the natural reason of man, but it is not necessary to speak of that. So natural law has the language of a natural law has also the merit of referring to something well known, to something traditional, but in the same sense, in the same time, eterno, come si dice? Eternal, no? When we say that the family is an institution of a natural law, it appears in the same sense, in the same time, something we have always had, no? Family has always been here, no? And in the same time, something which is eternal. So I think that this is a real force of the Church, of the Catholic language. I don't know if the Protestant language has the same force, but I don't know very well.
I hope we can continue the discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.